When I broke my arm, a true story. One day, when I was on a monkey bars on the highest one and fall, and I broke my arm, my mom take me to the hospital. They gave me a cast. My arm was broke for 3 days. I went home the third day. Now, I'm scared to go on monkey bars again in my life. There's this day, my mom said, "Are you okay?" I said, "No, it hurts." When it got off, I was okay. Now I'm scared of the monkey bars. So now I don't want to go outside to the monkey bars. My mom and me went outside on the monkey bars. My mom came to the monkey bars. She helped me and I made it. Then the monkey bars. I said, I can make it. It was so fun. The end. This is Arts Educators Save the World, where successful artists and their mentors talk about how arts education transformed their lives. Hey, welcome to Arts Educators Save the World, a podcast about artists and their mentors, talking about the impact that mentorship and arts education have had on both of their lives. This is number 2 in the series of chats. TBD what we're going to name them, hoping for you all to weigh in. Otherwise, they're going to be called Doug. So let's get at it on what we should call these conversations between myself and my delightful co-host, Alek, where we take an aspect of my book, How the Arts Can Save Education, and we use that as an opportunity to talk all things transformation of the role of the arts in teaching and learning and design of learning environments, and the way we ought to understand how to change kids' lives for the better. Hi, Alek.
Hi, Erica. Well, let's just jump right in. Continuing on from last time, we learned a little bit about your group, Whoopin' Soccer or Hoopin' Soccer, and we know that they create stories. You've told us that they create stories, and then we have the adult cast, your team, perform the stories. Let's slow down a little. Start me from the beginning of this story creation process. What's the first thing you do? How do you elicit stories? Or if there's something that comes before that, please walk us through that.
Yeah, so the classroom residency part of our work, which is what most people would consider the quote-unquote educational part of our mission, is where
Well, hold on. What's with the quotes? Tell me about that.
Well, I think, not everyone sees theater performance as in and of itself educational. I think there is a little bit of what my friend Constance would call chocolate-covered broccoli scenario with theater performance, which is, all right, you got to do the part where there's schooly stuff and there's writing and there's notebooks and you got to be quiet. But if you get through that, then in the end, you get to see a play. That's why I said, quote unquote, educational. I obviously don't believe that educational stuff is always the broccoli, or that theater and performance is just chocolate.
Right.
But so that's why I use the quotes. Maybe I should take them back.
Talk about it.
But in the classroom, each week that we're there with kids, we have a different theme as a spark or inspiration for creative expression. So we write stories from pictures that we bring in that are purposely selected for their cultural variety and diversity, interesting artistic representational characteristics. So we might bring modern art paintings into the space to give kids a chance to think about how they might create a story from a cubist painting. We make sure that different bodies and faces are represented in the pictures, and then we use those pictures as inspirations for writing stories.
By the way, this would be fairly obvious to some people, but less obvious to others. Can you talk a little bit about that? About the you are not virtue signaling here by saying we need to have different types of bodies and different types of people. I know that this comes from an educator's place and a human
Yes.
place, but can you just tell us why should you do that? Why shouldn't everyone just look like Dick and Jane?
Yeah, I mean, and actually the original inspiration for that came from my professor, advisor, mentor, Carol Lee. When I worked with her on a project she was doing in elementary schools, where she was working with African American elementary school students on drawing out the cultural assets that they were bringing into the classroom that weren't necessarily getting recognized by standard literacy curricula. So, for example, there's a lot of really rich literature on how African American vernacular English, AAVE, has really dynamic and artistic and sophisticated language use and discourse use that is typically not welcome in the classroom, but is actually linguistically very sophisticated and often quite funny and quite touching. And so Carol brought a series of photographs of paintings by the artist Annie Lee, who is an African-American female artist who depicted scenes of African-American life in her paintings. And so we brought Annie Lee paintings into the classroom as the foundation for kids' story writing. And what we found was kids were drawing on those AAVE features when they had images that evoked those kinds of ways of knowing and doing and being and talking in their brains, right? So you see an image of something that connects for you, and then you're able to access all of these cultural ways of talking and doing that are typically not prompted in a classroom. And, we also know on the other side of that quote unquote, and now I'm again with the quotes, but quote unquote standard images like,
right,
two kids on a farm may be really evocative for kids who live near farms. But
right.
If you're not from farm country, that brings you no connections. And is less inspiring, perhaps.
I also think that word standard is very important. It goes to what you're talking about, the difference between African American vernacular English and standard English, that there is still this notion that one is right and one is wrong, or one is jargony, or one is less than in any way, broken, unlearned, whatever it is. Just the same way you might say, well, a standard American life, life on a farm, or life, in a, I guess you'd say, people might say a big city, whatever it is, but and I think it goes to everything that you're doing, and there's standard forms of education, but just that the challenging question of, can you drop that entirely as a formation in your head? That is, standard English happens to be the way certain things are written in certain places in the New York Times. That doesn't make it right. It doesn't matter what a dictionary says. Dictionary is just a bunch of people that got together and wrote some stuff down. But just how you speak at home, why shouldn't it be respected anywhere and everywhere? Whether it's whether it's at home, or it's at school, or it's in your valedictorian speech. Anytime you're saying to someone, what you're doing is non-standard and thus wrong, different, special, come to us on this side, you're necessarily going to be quashing something in them. And I think that is obviously also just your educational and theatrical philosophy also, namely that bring your story. Your story counts from wherever it comes from.
Yep. Yes to all of that. And, globally, some of our most successful writers are as successful as they are because they're drawing on that wide range, right? Like Toni Morrison is probably one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, and her fiction is to use a fancy word, replete with a range of different discourse markers that is what makes her successful. And so, the idea that like you have to learn the basics first in order to be able to do the thing that Toni Morrison can do, or in order to be able to do the thing that our most successful creative artists can do, it is, again, it's just a backwards idea. It's backwards. Right. It's backwards to push everybody through a straw with the idea that at the end, you're going to be expected to be in a giant cup. I don't know if that metaphor works. I guess my point is that the pushing through a straw doesn't really do anything for people cognitively or socially or culturally. So that's a one day that we do where we work with kids. But I think because of the story that you heard me read at the top of the episode, I'll talk a little bit about True Story Day, which is another week that we draw inspiration for writing stories and how that process goes.
Right. So how many weeks is the whole residency?
Well, the in-classroom time is 6 weeks. There's a seventh week where teaching artists read everything the kids write and give them feedback on their writing so that kids then, after the residency and after the performance, they have an opportunity to see how their adult teaching artists have responded to their work. And then there's an 8th week, which is the professional performance of the kids' work, where the kids go to a professional theater space to see their stories performed by adults. So 6 weeks in the classroom, but really kind of 8 weeks worth of stuff.
I want to hear about, I know the third week you start those personal stories. Yeah. Just in case anyone is flagging this, you're talking a lot about writing words onto a page in whatever dialect it might be. What happens when you either have a classroom filled with kids who are not yet writing, or you just have a few kids who are not yet writing? What accommodations are made for that?
So I'll say a little bit more about that when I talk about process, but I will also say that there are lots of ways that people can get things from head to paper. Dictation is a totally acceptable form. Collaboration with peers. Kids know which kids are faster writers than others. And if they're friends, they can work together. They know, I know that you're better at writing than me. I may be better at math than you. So I'll be like, oh, we got to write this down? Yeah, I'm not so good at that. Hey, Alek, how about we come up with the idea together and you write it down? Sometimes kids draw their ideas, and then a teaching artist will listen to them talk through the drawing as a way to understand how the drawing represents words. Sometimes all a kid needs is an adult to start it for them, and that gives them the confidence they need to actually literally take over the process. During COVID, kids made a lot of videos of themselves telling stories, which is something that we've talked about going back to. It's quite hard to introduce that technology real time into a classroom. And so we haven't quite cracked the nut of allowing kids to video themselves telling a story in the live classroom space. It's just sort of logistically challenging, but that was really successful when all the kids were working from home.
Right. I could also imagine that one of the last things we maybe need to do now is find ways to bring our phones into the classrooms and use that, give us some space, please. What you're saying also is quietly or not so quietly revolutionary, like so many of the things you're saying. The idea that I think a traditional classroom would say, we all need to do X in order to get to Y and then to Z. But what you're saying is we all like to express something, but we're not going to do it the same way. And it's okay. It's okay that these three people are not going to write the English words down. Excuse me. But these three people are, and these are going to tell a story. And that's not standard education right there. But what it's saying is it's almost like you're seeing through all of that. It's like what my wife, this is the Sarah Says portion of our program, various phrases are used for this, the idea of brave spelling, I think is what one of her schools called it, that when you're 4, when you're 5, when you're 6, when they're learning to write, the last thing you want to do is point to a word and say, you spelled this incorrectly, right? You'll get to that. But that's going to make a kid perhaps next time not try anything at all. And I see what story you're trying to tell. Full stop. There's no but there at all. And I hear this also with you is, I want you to tell me something. Or you're not going to write it down. What are you going to do? And we'll get to the next step together without having quite the same building blocks to get us there. Does that sound right?
Absolutely. And I think, Sarah works with our youngest learners who really are emerging as writers, like, maybe writing for the first time. We work primarily with upper elementary school students, 3rd and 4th graders, for most of whom have some capacity around the writing. And some kids, by the way, can already write novels by 4th grade. So to be clear, some kids, and this is where, to go back to my, I think is a quite radical idea, that if we were really going to do education right, we would not be wedded to all kids doing the same thing at the same time as evidence of good learning. And that's exactly why. Some kids are writing novels when they're 9 years old. Some kids, have longer trajectories for motor skill development, and it takes them a very long time. Or some kids are struggling with the sound symbol relationship and they're working it through. Some kids have 2 sound symbol relationships in their heads because they speak Spanish at home and they speak English at school. It is very common for kids who, for example, speak both Spanish and English to have V and B swaps in their writing because of the way those consonants sound in those different languages. What we always say in Movement Soccer is we're super good at reading spelling.
Yeah.
So don't worry about it because we're really good at reading how people spell. And usually that works. Sometimes kids will say, how do you spell this? How do you spell that? And you can kind of gauge in the moment, do you want to just give it to them? Because they're like, how do you spell thorough?
If they're asking.
Right. And if they're asking something that you're like, oh, you're asking because this is maybe outside of your comfort zone, but you really want that word, And if a kid is like, how do I spell park? I might be like, spell it how you spell it. I'm good at reading it. Go ahead.
Right.
So yes, that is in my mind sort of the 3rd, 4th grade version of the invented spelling is another term that we use for that.
Yep.
My name is Graham Isidore. I have a progressive eye disease called keratoconus. Admitting I'm losing my vision has been hard, but explaining it to other people has been harder. Lately, I've been trying to talk about it. Short-sighted is an attempt to explain what vision loss feels like by exploring how it sounds. By sharing my story, we get into all the things you don't see about hidden disabilities. Short-sighted from CBC's Personally, available now.
I promise I will let you get to the When I Broke Your Arm story, because if not, the cold open of this show, the part you heard before the music, won't make any sense. But let me ask you a question that's probably going to take a 4-year education to learn. But again, for those who are hearing what these craziest things that we're saying and going, yeah, but like they need to go out in the world eventually and know how to speak English and know math and science and know all of these things. What do you say to calm the nerves of whether it's teachers or principals or parents who are saying, when are we going to get to school? Because like we got to go, I got to pass some tests and all that stuff.
I mean, I think there's always going to be the battle with the content people, right? The people who see the purpose of school as content acquisition. At a very fundamental level, if we can articulate what humans actually need to know in order to be successful participants in our society, the majority of that is not content. Most of it is, how do you communicate successfully? What are the range of ways that communication can happen, needs to happen? How do you ask questions? How do you be a curious person, right? Science ought to be about, and is about in many ways, the development of curiosity and equipping people with the skills to ask questions and to answer questions. Like, what is a science, like a lab report, other than a representation of an effort to ask and answer a question, right? So I think standardization in some ways has forced us to take our eyes off some of those prizes to say, like, the goal is to create curious humans. So how do you create curious humans?
And empathetic? Would you throw empathy in there as a
absolutely,
top?
Absolutely. I think a lot of folks would say civically engaged, like, and empathy is a part of civic engagement, but there's also like, how do you see yourself as contributing to the world in which we live? So those are the things that education ought to do. And we've developed content containers that we think represent how you do all those things, right? Why do we think it's important, at least some places, to teach a language other than the language that you know growing up? Like, why do you need to take, if you are an English-only speaker, why do you need to take Spanish or French or German, right? Like, yeah, it's a box you check off, but it's because we fundamentally think it's important that we be able to communicate with one another, right?
Right.
Why do we have why have we developed a whole sequence of mathematics as like a big content bucket in our schooling? Because we think it's really that to participate successfully in the world, you need to be able to see things computationally, like practically, because of like paying bills and earning money and all of that. But like representationally, because you can understand different things when you see things when you see the world numerically as opposed to narratively. So it is a radical idea. And also, and one other thing about the radical nature of it, school should not be a race. And the metaphor of race, and I don't mean human race, I mean running race, that metaphor, which frankly, the No Child Left Behind started and the Obama administration really leaned into, was race
they used the word, right?
Race to the top.
Race to the top.
Right?
Yeah.
That I am always confused by the idea that the goal of school is to get somewhere fastest. Like, what?
Right.
Why? What is the point of getting there faster? So that you can do more? Okay. Or so that you can prove that you're better than other people? I mean, I think it is a pretty radical notion, which is why we embed it in already existing structures.
Right. Okay, so that wrapped us around to our story. And
Yeah.
can you tell us a little bit about the broken arm and how that is developed and how you do wrap that into the existing structure of the schools in which you are working?
Yeah. So
See how I did that?
that
I
was
turned that all
great.
back around
You
to
turn-
relevant. Thank you.
You're a professional. This is why you're a professional.
Okay.
So we do have a week that is True Story Day, Personal Story Day. One of the very obvious connections is that kind of storytelling is part of our curricular standards for elementary school, that kids be able to tell and write stories, personal narratives of things that have happened to them. And obviously, we've all been to school. That comes up a lot, right? We are often asked to write about something that's happened to us. So that's an easy in, and teachers are usually pretty excited that we're going to give a leg up in some ways, like give kids opportunities to think about that. And so we use our I do, we do, you do structure that starts with teaching artists telling groups of kids stories of things that really happened to us. And one of the things that we learned early on is that the kind of stories that we tell will very much connect to the kinds of stories that kids will tell. And I have a little anecdote in my book that one time, both myself and another teaching artist told stories about the times that we forgot to wear pants, which
Sure.
we got like 23 stories about the times I forgot to wear pants. Because kids' scripts, like internal mental scripts, were so trained on that, right? Injury stories are very common. That is a universal feature of childhood, right? That you have hurt yourself in some way. I hit my head on the diving board, or my sister, trapped me in the closet, and I don't know, whatever. This is a universal feature. So we often have teaching artists tell an injury story as a way to get kids to be like, oh yeah, that time that I fell off my bike, that time, right?
Right.
Overcoming fears is another one, like the time I was scared to go on the roller coaster, but did. So a teaching artist tells a story to a group of people, a group of kids, and then that group of kids acts out that story for the rest of the class. And so they get some practice embodying stories. We also try to tell stories that have a range of roles, from main speaking characters to, like I often tell the story of the time that I gave birth. And so there is an opportunity for a monitor, like a thing that you hook up to somebody's, the beep, 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 for a kid who may not be ready to say words in a performance, but wants to have a role. We also have kids what we call like hold the paper. So we often write the stories on big, they call it teacher's gold. It's like the sticky papers, but the giant ones that are yellow with they look like legal pads, except they're giant and sticky. So we often write stories on that. And if there's a kid who is really reluctant to be on stage, we have them hold the paper, because what we always say is you can't tell a story if you don't know what the story says. So you need the paper holder, and that's legit. So we do that, and then all the kids have a chance to go and write their own true story. And this is a day where everybody's got something to say, because everybody has a story of something that's happened to them. They've gone to visit their cousins in Chicago for a birthday party, or their, dad came home from the military for Christmas, or depending on the time of year, right? We'll get a lot of Halloween stuff, like the time I dressed up, like Megan Thee Stallion for Halloween, because the Halloween just happened. So this story that I read you is obviously injury story. It's also an overcoming fear story. And Cameron, which is the name I give him in my book, that is not his actual name, had been pretty reluctant as a writer up until this point and reluctant as a participant. But when I read over his shoulder what he'd written, what I read you was word for word. So for an early third grader, pretty easy read. And so I said to him,
pretty fantastic, like 3-act structure. Also, like that's a play.
He sat down and wrote that all on his own.
Yeah.
And so I said, okay, I knew that I wanted to like take advantage of the opportunity that he'd written a thing that he was proud of, that he was confident in. So I said, how about this? How about you read it out loud and my fellow co-teaching artists and I will act it out in the classroom. But in order...
Just right then and there. Not like as the final performance.
No, like
just
improvise.
Right then and there.
And I said, but in order for you to do that, you got to read it loud enough for me and Brian to hear. Right? Because we're old,
tricky.
Number one. Number two, we're making it up as we go. So we need you to tell the story in a way. So he did that, and it was great, and it was super well received. And then we decided, the acting company decided to include that story in our show. And probably the most memorable feature of that was the way that the cast picked up on the fear was they created, the monkey bars themselves were portrayed by actors who were sort of cartoon-like, super scary faces and voices, but only to the kid. So other kids could swing on them. The mom would go over and say, look, it's just the monkey bars. And then as soon as everyone would turn away, all of the people playing the monkey bars would make super scary faces and growl at the kid, and then you can do the joke where somebody turns around and they super quick pop up and they're silent as if nothing is happening. And so we leaned into that aspect of the story to universalize how people overcome fears and how scary something can be, even when it's not scary to anybody else, as another way to represent Cameron's story to an audience.
As we got to wrap up here, so much more to say. I'll just say that as someone who makes plays, I'm aware that I'm making a play. I'm aware that we're rehearsing it. I'm aware that we're getting it ready to stage, and I'm aware that it's going to be on. And still, seeing it up there on stage is mind-blowing. It's there now. It's just happening. I can only imagine from a kid who didn't even want to, had nothing to say at first. I can't answer that. There's some sort of shyness, whatever it is. And then like adults are just, it's a thing that has got to be just an incredible ride for them to go on.
They, for the most part, they freak out. Some kids are a little more.
That's what I do. That's what I do on opening night. It's really awkward. I'm just in the audience
freaking out. Well, the other thing is, one of the things I love about building these kinds of communities is actually all the kids freak out. So they hear, like the first time they're hearing it is when at the beginning of a sketch we say, this is When I Broke My Arm by Cameron. And there's like 3 seconds. And then all the kids go, oh my God, Cameron. And they all turn around to see where Cameron is in the theater.
Right.
And like the buds that he's sitting next to are like, hey, and pointing at him,
and they don't know that their piece is going to be included until they see it.
They don't.
Oh, that's a great idea.
And it's partly for that. It is also partly because we don't want to advertise that that's somehow cooler than being a part of the residency, right? It's sort of like random bonus at the end. Oh, it's your story. As opposed to like, listen, kids, the best stories get put in the show, which is not at all how that works. No. And also we are quite purposeful about whose stories we select because we get to know the kids and we have some idea of which kids will really benefit and shine from having their story represented. And that plays a role in the way we design a performance. And so, that moment, and particularly when, if it's, for example, a kid who's maybe a new arrival to the US, who's written something, maybe for the first time, the kids go crazy for it. Because they know that this is a kid who's in a new space, new language, new everything. And like, here's a celebration of them. And kids are cool that way. They're not like, oh, boo, down with the new kid. They're like, oh my God, right. Sammy, look, it's your play, right? And they all love it.
Amazing. All right, kids are cool. Let's wrap this up for today's talk. Erica, what tell us things.
Well,
wrap this up.
Now we're getting in the groove and we're talking about big ideas from my book. If you have an idea in arts education, specifically in my book, if you're like, I'm an Erica Halverson fan and here's something from the book I'd like to hear you talk about. Or if you're an arts educator or an educator or a parent or an artist and you have a question that you want us to talk about, we would love for you to let us know. So send us an email at contact@artseducatorspodcast.com. Put in the subject line, chat idea or Doug idea. Or if you have an idea for what we should call these, put that in the subject line too. We would love to hear from you. We are going to continue this as a regular series, and we're excited to talk about things that you want to hear about. So be part of the conversation, join us, and onward together.
Arts Educators Save the World is hosted by Erica Rosenfeld Halverson and produced and co-hosted by me, Alek Chats. Our executive producer is Doug Matica, and our audio producer is Justin Asher. Special thanks to our collaborators, the brilliant and talented Kate Baldwin, and our great friends at Story Pirate Studios, Lee Overtree, Benjamin Salka, and Amy Fiore. Original music is by Dan Lipton, and our artwork is by Lyra Evans. Check out our website designed by Cole Locasio at www.artseducatorspodcast.com. We're on Instagram at artseducatorspodcast, and you can write to us with your questions and comments at contact@artseducatorspodcast.com. You can also find us at a place called YouTube. And wherever you're listening, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review. It really helps the show. We're proud to be sponsored in part by the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Gibb Faculty Fellowship. Arts Educators Save the World was created by Erica Rosenfeld Halverson and Alek Chats.